Welcome back, everyone. We're diving back into Ukraine and the front lines. And, you know, it's a weird time right now.
Yeah.
It seems quiet on the surface.
Yeah.
But I don't know if quiet is really the right word, because there's a lot of
tension.
Yeah.
A lot of anticipation. Like something's coming.
There is a sense that this is the calm before the storm.
Yeah. And
even Russian military commentators have been sort of hinting that something's coming. We've seen that on multiple Telegram channels.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, it's interesting. It is a curious lull. We'll have to see how long it lasts.
Yeah, and I guess that makes it a perfect time for us to dive in and see if we can make sense of anything.
Absolutely.
So let's start with, I guess, Zaporizhia Oblast. We're seeing some conflicting information coming out of there about who controls what. Yeah, there are reports that Russian forces have managed to retake some positions in a place called Kamensk, and they're claiming that they pushed back Ukrainian forces who had previously gained ground. But the interesting thing is that we've not seen confirmation from the Ukrainian side.
So it's just radio silence from the Ukrainians.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a bit of an information blackout.
Yeah, and of course the landscape there is pretty significant, right? The Dnieper River runs right through the region. Crossing a river that size, especially under fire.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
It's a huge undertaking. I mean, even if they did manage to advance, holding that ground and pushing further would be incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, that river is just a natural barrier.
Yeah.
It presents a huge logistical and strategic hurdle for any advancing force.
Makes sense. So control of the river crossings becomes extremely important.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely crucial.
So speaking of crucial locations, another one that we need to unpack is Velika Novosilka. Yeah. Again, we're seeing a situation where the Russians are claiming victory.
Right.
Saying that they've captured this village.
Yeah.
And again, we're not seeing the Ukrainians concede the loss.
Right.
But all signs point to the Russians being in control.
Yeah.
So what is it about this particular village?
It's not that Velika Novosilka itself is some major strategic target, but it's more about what controlling it allows. You know, think of it as a stepping stone, a foothold in the region. And maybe even more importantly, whoever holds that village also has access to the surrounding high ground.
So it's all about like a king on a chessboard. You control the high ground, you control the game.
Exactly. Exactly. It gives them a commanding view of the surrounding area.
Right.
It makes it much easier to defend their position and to launch further operations.
Yeah.
And it raises the question, where will Russia go from here?
Well, there are a couple of possibilities, right?
Yeah. They
could push north towards Novocherecheve. Maybe try to cut deeper into Zaporizhia Oblast heading west. They could even try to encircle Ukrainian forces near Oleksandrivka. So there are quite a few options open to them.
Absolutely. Each of those options has its own opportunities and its own risks.
Yeah.
And we need to keep in mind this isn't the only area where things are heating up. We're also seeing some really heavy fighting along the Volkhov River.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of back and forth along that river.
Yeah.
With the Russians managing to take on Drivka.
That's right.
They've made some inroads near Ozlenivka and Dakhna. Their ultimate goal, it seems, is to take Ulakti. Yeah. Which would be a significant step towards controlling the T-15 highway.
Absolutely. The T-15 is a key artery in the region.
Yep.
And capturing Ulakti would be a major win for Russia. However, they are encountering some stiff resistance from Ukrainian defenders there.
Okay.
And, you know, this highlights a trend that we're seeing emerge across the front. It seems like maybe the overall intensity of the conflict has decreased a little bit.
Right.
But the fighting in certain areas is still incredibly fierce.
Yeah, it's almost like instead of one giant conflict, it's like a bunch of small ones kind of bubbling up.
Kind of like what we're seeing near Novoandrivka, where there's this constant back and forth struggle for control.
Yeah.
And then you've got the ongoing Russian assaults in the Donetsk region on places like Shribne, Zaporizhia, Mala Preobrazhenka.
Right.
That's a really important area because it provides access to the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast.
Oh.
And we've actually seen confirmed reports of Russian forces capturing Novoyelizavetivka and Nadivka.
Yeah.
Both of those are right on the border of that oblast.
Yeah.
In fact, Nadivka is a mere 8.5 kilometers from the regional border.
And that's especially worrying when we consider all of the conflicting information we're getting about manpower.
Yeah.
Some sources are claiming that Russia has this, huge advantage in terms of troop numbers.
Yeah.
Others are saying that the ratio may actually favor Ukraine. It's tough to know what to believe.
Absolutely. You have to sift through a lot of noise to get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
And even then, things are constantly changing.
Right. Like the reports we were seeing earlier about the million-man Ukrainian army, and now we're seeing some Ukrainian estimates suggesting a 2-to-1 troop ratio in favor of Russia.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
It is. It is. It raises a lot of questions about the accuracy of the information we're getting.
Yeah, for sure. And then you have the battle for Pokrovsk continuing.
Yeah.
The Russians are pressing their attack from Zverev. They're pushing towards Vodian.
Right.
The Ukrainians are launching counterattacks.
Yeah.
It's this real tug of war.
It is. It is. It's a classic stalemate with small gains and losses on both sides.
Yeah.
But no real breakthrough. And I think this raises another important point. This conflict is incredibly costly.
Yeah.
In terms of manpower and resources.
Yeah.
Attrition is a major factor. Each side trying to wear down the other's forces. It's really a question of how long they can both sustain this.
Exactly. And with the human costs of this stalemate, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the strategic details.
Yeah.
But ultimately this is a war with real people.
It is.
Real consequences.
It's a crucial point, and it's one we should never lose sight of. The longer this drags on, the greater the suffering will be for everyone involved. And it's not just about physical casualties.
Right.
The psychological and the economic toll is immense.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what it would even take to break this stalemate?
Yeah.
Is there potential for negotiation?
Yeah.
Or are both sides just too entrenched in their positions?
I think that's a question we'll explore in more detail in a later part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But first, I think we should shift our focus to another area where the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay. Right. That's where the Ukrainian garrison is desperately clinging to the northern outskirts of the city, even after losing control of Kharkov. Why are they so determined to hold this position?
I think it really comes down to trying to prevent a domino effect.
Ooh.
If Toretsk falls, it opens the door for the Russians to advance rapidly towards other key locations.
Okay.
Chasiv Yar would likely be next.
Right.
And from there, who knows how far they could push.
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians seem to be calculating that even a costly defense of Toretsk is preferable to a rapid Russian advance.
So it's a delaying tactic.
Yeah.
Buy them some time to regroup,
Exactly.
reinforce defenses elsewhere.
Slowing the pace of the Russian advance, making them pay a price for every inch of territory they gain.
Makes sense. But how long can those Ukrainian defenders hold out?
I don't know. That is a good question. And what will the consequences be if they do fall?
Yeah. Well, those are all questions that I guess we'll have to grapple with as this situation unfolds. But for now, I think we should take a look further north.
Right.
Near Novosolivka and Udakne.
Yes. Another area where we're seeing a familiar pattern. Back and forth, fighting, both sides claiming control at various points. It highlights how fluid the front lines are and the challenges of getting accurate information in real time.
Yeah. It's almost impossible to keep up sometimes.
It is. It is.
It's like trying to pin down a moving target. And speaking of moving targets, the Russians seem to be making some headway near Stupatsky.
Yeah.
On the border of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv oblasts.
Yeah, that's a strategically important area because
Yeah.
it sits at the junction of 3 oblasts. So if the Russians can solidify their control there, it opens up a lot of possibilities for them to launch operations in multiple directions.
Oh, wow.
Give them a lot of options, a lot of flexibility.
Yeah.
And that's always a valuable asset in warfare.
Yeah, for sure. But then you have the situation around Novorodivka where the information is just incredibly murky.
Yeah.
Some Russian sources claiming that they captured the town,
Right.
while others, even some military commentators, are disputing those claims.
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure. I think this is where the fog of war becomes a major factor. Information can be inaccurate, delayed, or even deliberately manipulated.
Yeah.
So, you have to be really cautious about accepting any claims at face value.
Right.
Especially when they're coming from sources that have a vested interest in the outcome.
Right. It's a good reminder that we need to be critical consumers of information,
Absolutely.
especially in a conflict zone like this. Can't just take everything at face value.
No. Critical thinking is essential in these situations.
Yeah.
We need to be discerning, avoid jumping to conclusions. And sometimes we just have to acknowledge that we just don't have all the information and reserve judgment until a clearer picture emerges.
That's really good advice. So on that note, let's move on to an area where it seems a bit clearer, to the Rechna. The Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that they've captured the town.
Right.
But there are still reports of Ukrainian forces in the area.
Yeah. It's likely that the situation is still fluid.
Okay.
Pockets of resistance remaining. But if the Russians can secure the nearby heights and the river crossings, it's going to make it very difficult for Ukrainian forces to hold on.
It seems like we're seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
Control of rivers, high ground road networks.
Yeah.
It seems like all these things are really proving to be decisive in this conflict.
Absolutely. Key terrain features are everything.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us to the possibility of a renewed Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region.
Right.
They've been making attempts to capture Kupiansk and Veliki Burluk.
Yep.
And if they can seize those key heights, expand their bridgehead near Topoli, that would certainly facilitate such an offensive.
Absolutely. It seems like they're aiming to establish a new buffer zone in the Kharkiv region, pushing Ukrainian forces further back from the border.
Right.
They're targeting villages like Bahalovka and trying to restrict Ukrainian movement along the border. This is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider that earlier expectations were for a buffer zone to be established in the Kursk Oblast.
Huh. So they're kind of shifting their focus then.
It appears so.
Changing their strategy on the fly.
It seems like they're adapting to the changing circumstances on the ground, looking for opportunities to exploit weaknesses and gain an advantage. And this brings us to another key aspect of this conflict: the ongoing exchange of missile and drone strikes.
Right. We've seen reports of damage to energy infrastructure in Uman, which led to blackouts in Chernihiv. There have been attacks on buildings in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, strikes on industrial facilities in Izmail, even a drone that was reportedly shot down near a metro station in Kyiv.
Yeah. These strikes are a reminder that this conflict extends far beyond the front lines.
Yeah.
Both sides are targeting each other's infrastructure and civilian areas.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous trend and one that raises serious concerns about escalation.
Exactly. And those concerns are amplified by the fact that Ukraine has also been striking targets within Russia itself.
Right.
We've seen those reports of attacks on oil refineries in the Bryansk region and a drone that was intercepted near the Smolensk nuclear power plant. It's this tit-for-tat targeting of infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's incredibly worrying.
It is.
It feels like we're on a slippery slope towards a wider conflict.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game of brinkmanship. Each side is trying to test the limits without triggering a full-blown escalation.
Right. So what would trigger a wider conflict?
Yeah, what are the red lines that neither side wants to cross?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that's really hard to answer with any certainty. But I think it's safe to say that the use of weapons of mass destruction or a direct attack on a NATO member would almost certainly lead to a major escalation.
I think so. I think those are scenarios that would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. And the international community would be forced to respond in a much more decisive way.
Yeah. But even without those extreme scenarios, the potential for escalation is still really high.
It is. It is.
The situation is so volatile. Any number of things could spark a wider conflict.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. It really makes you wonder what the end game is here.
Yeah.
What are the possible outcomes of this conflict? And what are the chances of a peaceful resolution?
Well, those are questions that I think we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at the factors that could lead to escalation.
Yeah.
Explore the potential for negotiation. And analyze the difficult choices facing President Zelenskyy.
So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll continue to unpack all the complexities of this evolving conflict.
There's a lot more to discuss, and we'll be back shortly to continue our analysis. So Another area of this conflict that's really intensifying is the Kursk Oblast.
Okay.
This is where Russian forces are really pushing to force Ukrainian troops back towards the Malolunkia River.
And this is where that, the strategic importance of geography really comes into play. We're seeing, classic military maneuvers like pincer movements being employed to try to gain an advantage.
Oh, absolutely. Pincer movements involve attacking an enemy force from two sides simultaneously.
Right.
The aim is to encircle them and trap them.
Yeah.
It's a tactic that requires a lot of coordination, precise timing.
Yeah.
And when it's executed effectively, it can be absolutely devastating.
Wow.
And that's exactly what we're seeing in Kursk. Russian forces are advancing near Viktorivka and Nikolsky while also pushing along a line that runs from Kamyshov to Kanedin.
So they're essentially squeezing Ukrainian forces from multiple directions.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to box them in.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse for the Ukrainians, the Russians are also attempting to cross the Sayul River and encircle their positions near Sverdlikov and Lebedivka. It's a multi-pronged offensive designed to dislodge Ukrainian forces from this strategically important territory.
And what's the ultimate objective here? Are they trying to capture specific towns and cities, or is it more about just controlling the terrain?
It's probably a combination of both.
Okay.
Capturing key towns and cities would give Russia more leverage in any future negotiations.
Right.
But controlling the terrain itself is also really important. It's about denying the Ukrainians access to resources, transportation routes, strategic positions.
Right.
It's about weakening their overall capabilities and limiting their options.
So it's a war of attrition on multiple levels. It's not just about, inflicting casualties, but also about gradually wearing down the enemy's ability to fight.
Exactly. It's a long game, a test of endurance and willpower.
Yeah.
And speaking of endurance, we can't ignore the ongoing exchange of missile and drone strikes that's happening alongside the ground fighting.
Right.
These strikes are a constant threat, a reminder that the conflict can reach far beyond the front lines at any moment.
And a terrifying reality, I imagine, for civilians living in those areas. We've seen those reports, of damage to energy infrastructure in Uman,
right,
which resulted in blackouts in Chernihiv. There have been those attacks on buildings in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, strikes on industrial facilities in Izmail, even a drone that was reportedly shot down near a metro station in Kyiv.
These strikes are a stark reminder that this conflict isn't confined to the battlefield.
Yeah.
It's impacting the lives of ordinary people far away from the front lines, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that permeates Ukrainian society.
Right. And it's not just Ukraine that's being targeted.
Right. We've also seen Ukrainian strikes on targets within Russia itself, including that attack on an oil refinery in the Bryansk region, and the drone that was intercepted near the Smolensk nuclear power plant. This tit-for-tat targeting of infrastructure is incredibly concerning.
It is. Is this a sign that the conflict is spiraling out of control?
It's certainly a worrying development.
Yeah.
It suggests that both sides are willing to escalate the conflict, even if it means risking a wider confrontation.
Right.
And this brings us to a crucial question.
Yeah.
What would trigger a major escalation in this war?
Right. What are those red lines?
Yeah. The ones that neither side wants to cross.
That's a question that's been on everyone's mind since this whole thing started. It's hard to say for sure what would tip the scales, but I think we can agree that the use of weapons of mass destruction would be a game changer.
Oh.
It would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict.
Absolutely.
And force the international community to intervene in a much more decisive way.
Yeah. The use of weapons of mass destruction would be a catastrophic escalation with potentially devastating consequences for the entire region. It's a line that we all hope will never be crossed. But even without resorting to those extreme measures, there's still a high risk of escalation.
Yeah.
The situation is volatile, and any number of factors could spark a wider conflict.
Like, for example, we've seen those increasing tensions between Russia and NATO.
Yeah.
A miscalculation or an accident could easily escalate into a direct confrontation between these two nuclear-armed powers.
That's a chilling thought, and it highlights the precariousness of the current situation. We're walking a tightrope, and one wrong step could have disastrous consequences. And in the midst of all this uncertainty, one man stands at the center of the storm, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He's facing an almost impossible dilemma.
He is.
On the one hand, he's under immense pressure to
continue fighting to resist Russian aggression at all costs.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he knows that the longer this conflict drags on, the more his people will suffer.
Exactly. He's caught between the need to defend his country and the desire to protect his people.
Yeah.
And to complicate matters further, his political survival is intricately tied to the outcome of this conflict.
So he's in a no-win situation. Damned if he does, damned if he doesn't.
In a sense, yes. If he agrees to a ceasefire or a negotiated settlement that is seen as a concession to Russia, he risks being labeled a traitor by his own people.
Right.
But if he continues fighting and the situation deteriorates further, he'll be blamed for the escalating death toll and the destruction of his country.
It's a heartbreaking situation, and one that really underscores the human cost of this conflict. It's easy to get caught up in the strategic analysis, the geopolitical maneuvering. But ultimately, this is a war about people. People are dying. Families are being torn apart. Lives are being shattered.
That's a point we should never forget. Behind the headlines, behind the statistics, there are real people whose lives have been irrevocably altered by this conflict.
Right.
And their stories deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering that's taking place.
No.
We need to remember that every casualty is a human being.
Yes.
A life lost, a family devastated.
And we need to keep asking ourselves, what can we do to help? How can we contribute to a peaceful resolution of this conflict?
Right.
Because ultimately, that's the only outcome that truly matters.
Well said. Now let's shift gears a little bit. Talk about manpower.
Okay.
This is a crucial factor that could ultimately determine the outcome of the war.
It is.
And as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of conflicting information circulating about the troop strengths of both sides.
Yeah.
Some reports suggest that Russia has a significant advantage in terms of sheer numbers, while others claim that the ratio might actually favor Ukraine. So how do we make sense of these conflicting claims?
I think it's important to remember that information in a conflict zone is often unreliable.
Yeah.
Both sides have an incentive to exaggerate their own strength and downplay the strengths of their opponent.
Right.
Propaganda and disinformation are rampant, and it can be difficult to separate fact from fiction.
So we need to be cautious about accepting any claims at face value.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to look for corroborating evidence.
Yeah.
Consider the source. Be aware of potential biases.
Right. Critical thinking is essential in these situations.
It is.
We need to be discerning and avoid jumping to conclusions.
Yes. And sometimes we simply have to acknowledge that we just don't have all the information and reserve judgment until a clearer picture emerges.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the fog of war and lose sight of the bigger picture. But even with all the uncertainty surrounding troop numbers, I think one thing is clear. Manpower is a major concern for both sides.
Absolutely. Russia has reportedly suffered heavy casualties, and there are questions about their ability to sustain their current level of operations in the long term. They've already resorted to mobilizing reservists and recruiting fighters from abroad.
And on the Ukrainian side, there are concerns about exhaustion and morale.
Right.
I mean, their soldiers have been fighting bravely for months.
They have.
But even the most determined troops can reach a breaking point.
That's right. Fatigue, stress, and trauma can take a heavy toll on soldiers, both physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
And as the conflict drags on, these factors are going to become increasingly important.
So the human cost of this war isn't just measured in casualties. It's also measured in the physical and mental well-being of the soldiers who are fighting it.
Precisely. And that's something we should never forget. Now let's shift gears again and talk about the potential for a renewed Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region.
Okay. This is an area that's seen a lot of back and forth fighting over the past few months.
It has.
What's the latest on the ground? And what are the strategic implications of a renewed offensive in this region?
Well, as we discussed earlier, Russian forces have been making attempts to capture key towns like Kupiansk and Veliki Burlak. They've also been trying to expand their bridgehead near Topoli. If they can achieve those objectives, it would give them a much stronger position in the region.
So they're essentially trying to create a buffer zone along the border, pushing Ukrainian forces further back.
That seems to be the strategy.
Okay.
They're aiming to establish a zone of control that would make it much more difficult for Ukraine to launch counteroffensives or to receive supplies from the West.
And what about the potential for escalation? Could a renewed offensive in Kharkiv lead to a wider conflict?
It's certainly a possibility, as we've seen throughout this conflict. Any escalation on one side tends to be met with a counter-escalation on the other. So a renewed Russian offensive could easily trigger a more forceful Ukrainian response, which could then lead to further escalation from Russia and so on.
It's a dangerous cycle.
It is.
And one that we all hope can be avoided.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the situation on the ground is incredibly fluid and things can change very quickly. We need to stay informed, be aware of the potential risks, and continue to press for a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
Agree.
Now let's take a closer look at the political landscape in Ukraine. Examine the difficult choices facing President Zelenskyy.
This is a crucial aspect of the conflict that often gets overshadowed by the military developments.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely essential to understanding the dynamics at play.
Right.
As we mentioned earlier, Zelenskyy is facing an almost impossible dilemma.
He is. He's caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he's under immense pressure to continue fighting, to resist Russian aggression at all costs.
Yeah.
He's become a symbol of Ukrainian defiance.
Yeah.
And any sign of weakness could undermine his position both domestically and internationally.
Exactly. He's built his reputation on being a strong and unwavering leader, and any suggestion that he's willing to compromise with Russia could be politically damaging.
Right. Yeah.
On the other hand, he knows that the longer this conflict drags on, the more his people will suffer.
So he's balancing the need to project strength with the desire to protect his people.
Precisely.
Okay.
And it's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
If he pushes too hard for a military victory, he risks prolonging the conflict and inflicting further suffering on his people.
Right.
But if he shows any sign of weakness or willingness to concede to Russian demands, he risks undermining his own authority and alienating his allies.
It's a no-win situation.
Oh,
damned if he does, damned if he doesn't.
In a sense, yes. And to make matters even more complicated, there are internal divisions within Ukraine that he needs to navigate.
Yeah.
Not everyone agrees with his approach to the conflict.
Right.
And there are those who would prefer to see a more aggressive stance taken against Russia.
So he's not just facing pressure from Russia, but also from within his own country.
That's right. He's walking a tightrope trying to maintain national unity while also dealing with external threats.
Yeah.
It's a testament to his leadership skills that he's been able to hold things together as well as he has.
Yeah.
But it's a constant challenge.
It's a reminder that this conflict is about more than just military objectives or geopolitical maneuvering. It's also about people.
Yeah.
Their lives, their hopes, their fears. And it's about the difficult choices that leaders have to make in times of crisis.
Exactly. And those choices have far-reaching consequences, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive today. Everything from the tactical maneuvers on the front lines to the geopolitical chess match playing out on the world stage. Yeah. But as we wrap things up, I want to bring it back to, I guess, the core question. What happens next?
Right.
Where does this conflict go from here?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The situation is incredibly complex and fluid. There are so many factors that could influence where this goes.
It feels like we're at a crossroads with multiple paths leading into the unknown, some paths leading towards escalation, others towards a potential stalemate, and maybe a few, however faint, towards some form of resolution.
Yeah, I think you've captured the essence of the dilemma perfectly. Each of those paths carries its own set of risks and rewards its own potential for hope and despair.
Right.
So let's start by examining the path towards escalation, which unfortunately seems to be the most likely scenario based on current trends.
It's hard to ignore the signs.
It is.
Both sides seem to be digging in, reinforcing their positions, showing very little willingness to compromise. And as we talked about earlier, the ongoing exchange of missile and drone strikes targeting infrastructure and civilian areas is creating this dangerous cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation.
Exactly. Each attack, each escalation raises the stakes, and it makes it that much harder to step back from the brink. And the longer this conflict drags on, the greater the risk of a miscalculation, an accident, or even a deliberate provocation that could spiral out of control.
And the potential consequences of such an escalation are terrifying. I mean, we're talking about a conflict between nuclear-armed powers with the potential to draw in other countries and engulf the entire region in a wider war.
It's a chilling thought, and one that should give us all pause. The stakes are incredibly high, and the margin for error is razor thin. but we shouldn't give in to despair just yet.
Right.
While escalation is a very serious concern, it's not inevitable. There are other paths forward, even if they seem less likely at this moment.
Okay, so let's explore those paths. What about the possibility of a stalemate? Could we see a scenario where the fighting just grinds to a halt? Neither side is able to achieve a decisive victory.
It's certainly a possibility. I mean, we've already seen elements of a stalemate emerge in certain areas of the conflict. Both sides are locked in this bloody back and forth struggle for control of, these strategically important locations.
It's like tug of war we were talking about earlier in Bukrovsk.
Exactly. And as the conflict drags on and both sides become increasingly exhausted and depleted, the likelihood of a wider stalemate increases.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that a stalemate is not a solution in itself.
Right.
It's a pause,
a
holding pattern,
a
recognition that neither side can achieve its objectives through military force alone.
So what does a stalemate mean for the future of Ukraine? Does it mean a frozen conflict? The threat of renewed fighting always looming on the horizon.
That's a real danger. A frozen conflict would leave Ukraine in this state of perpetual limbo. Its territory divided, its economy shattered, and its people living under the shadow of war.
It would be a tragedy for the Ukrainian people who have already endured so much suffering.
It would be.
They deserve a future of peace and security, not a prolonged state of uncertainty and fear.
Absolutely. And that brings us to that third path, the one that everyone hopes for but seems increasingly elusive.
Right.
A negotiated settlement, a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
Is there any realistic hope for such an outcome at this point? I mean, both sides seem so entrenched in their positions, so unwilling to compromise.
It's true that the prospects for a negotiated settlement appear dim at the moment. There is a deep mistrust between the parties, and the gap between their respective positions seems insurmountable. Yeah.
Russia's demanding recognition of its territorial gains, while Ukraine insists on the restoration of its full sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's hard to see how those positions can be reconciled.
Yeah. It's a formidable challenge, no doubt. But history teaches us that even the most intractable conflicts can eventually be resolved through dialogue and negotiation.
Okay.
It requires both sides to recognize the futility of continued fighting, to acknowledge the need for compromise, and to prioritize the well-being of their people over narrow political or territorial ambitions.
It's a tall order, especially in the current climate of heightened tensions and, deep-seated animosity. But it's a goal worth striving for, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, the alternative, a prolonged conflict with the potential for catastrophic escalation, is simply too horrific to contemplate.
I couldn't agree more. The human cost of this conflict is already immense, and it will only continue to grow if a peaceful solution is not found.
So what can be done to break the impasse and pave the way for negotiations? What role can the international community play in facilitating dialogue and promoting a peaceful resolution?
Well, that's a question we could devote an entire deep dive to, but in short, it requires a multifaceted approach. It involves maintaining pressure on Russia through sanctions and diplomatic isolation, while also providing Ukraine with the military and economic support it needs to defend itself and deter further aggression.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Providing that support for Ukraine without provoking further escalation from Russia.
Exactly. And it requires a unified and coordinated effort from the international community. Unfortunately, we're seeing some signs of division and fatigue setting among some of Ukraine's key allies.
Yeah, the war is dragging on. The economic costs are mounting.
Right.
And there's this growing sense that this conflict could become a protracted stalemate with no clear end in sight. This is where leadership is crucial. We need leaders who are willing to stand up for principle, to defend the international order, and to support Ukraine's right to self-determination.
It's a call to action for all of us, really. We can't afford to become complacent or indifferent to the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We need to stay engaged, stay informed, and continue to demand a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
Well said. This deep dive has taken us on quite a journey.
It has.
Through the complexities of a conflict that has reshaped the geopolitical landscape and really tested the limits of international cooperation.
Yeah.
We've explored the tactical maneuvers on the battlefield, the strategic calculations of the key players, and of course the human cost of this ongoing tragedy.
We've examined the paths towards escalation, stalemate, and resolution, recognizing the fragility of the current situation and the urgent need for a peaceful solution.
And While the future remains uncertain, I think one thing is clear. The choices we make today will have a profound impact on the lives of millions of people in Ukraine and beyond.
Yeah.
We hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights and a deeper understanding of the challenges we face.
It's been a privilege to explore these complex issues with you.
Yeah. And to our listeners, we leave you with this thought. The pursuit of peace is a collective responsibility.
It is.
Let's not turn away from the suffering in Ukraine. Let's continue to demand a just and lasting resolution to this conflict. And in the meantime, let's do everything we can to support the Ukrainian people in their hour of need. Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.